Retirement in Australia is often sold like a lifestyle commercial filmed at golden hour. White beaches, endless sunsets, coffee dates that somehow last all afternoon, every afternoon. No one ever asks who's paying for those coffees. What usually gets edited out is the price tag, and how fast that fantasy unravels once housing, electricity, groceries, insurance, and healthcare all start lining up with their hands out. For many Australians edging toward retirement, the uncomfortable truth is this: staying exactly where you are might be the most expensive non-decision you ever make. Across the capital cities, median house prices have drifted so far out of reach that even a decent super balance can start to feel like loose change. Renting doesn't offer much comfort either. Annual increases creep in quietly, year after year, until what once felt manageable turns into a permanent low-level stress humming in the background of daily life. This is why a growing number of retirees aren't downsizing. They're uprooting, calmly, deliberately, with spreadsheets. They're not fleeing the country, and they're not chasing some glossy coastal fantasy with infinity pools and sunset yoga. They're doing something far less dramatic and far more practical. They're repositioning themselves toward towns where life slows down. Houses don't require a lifetime of debt, and dignity doesn't come with a luxury surcharge. This video isn't about dream destinations or brag-worthy postcodes. It's about places where the numbers still behave themselves, where retirement doesn't require constant financial triage or a weekly conversation with your bank app. These are Australian towns where budgets stretch further, expectations quietly reset, and life, while simpler, becomes noticeably more breathable. 8. Mildura. Mildura sits along the Murray River, wrapped in vineyards, citrus orchards, and a climate that does not believe in half measures. Summers are unapologetically hot, the kind of heat that makes shade a strategic decision. Winters, by contrast, are mild enough that jumpers feel optional rather than essential. With a population of roughly 55,000, Mildura is big enough to have hospitals, supermarkets, and coffee that isn't instant, but small enough that you'll start recognizing faces at the checkout whether you want to or not. Housing is Mildura's strongest argument. Median house prices generally sit around 390,000 Australian dollars to 430,000 Australian dollars, depending on the suburb and how recently the kitchen was last updated. Units are cheaper again. Renting is still comparatively manageable, with typical weekly rents around 370 Australian dollars to 430 Australian dollars for a standard two-bedroom place. For retirees living on the age pension or a modest super drawdown, that gap between housing costs and income is the difference between calm evenings and aggressive spreadsheet activity. Daily costs are mostly reasonable. Groceries can run slightly higher than in Melbourne due to transport, though local fruit markets help soften the blow. Electricity bills, however, do not mess around. Summer air conditioning can push annual power costs well past 2,000 Australian dollars if you're not careful. Healthcare covers everyday needs through Mildura Base Hospital, with specialist care sometimes requiring travel. Mildura isn't selling glamour, it's selling predictability, and in retirement, that's a luxury all its own. 7. Tamworth. Tamworth is best known as Australia's country music capital, but retirement here has far less to do with guitars and far more to do with practicality. Yes, there are boots, hats, and the occasional unsolicited live performance, but beneath the twang is a properly functioning regional city. Tamworth has hospitals, shopping centers, schools, an airport, and roads that don't require a stress management course to navigate. Tamworth Hospital services a large inland region, meaning most medical needs are handled locally without emergency road trips to bigger cities. Daily life includes cafes, walking trails, community clubs, and just enough activity to stop every day from feeling like Sunday. Housing remains one of its biggest advantages. Median house prices typically sit around 440,000 Australian dollars to 480,000 Australian dollars, depending on suburb and condition. Still a long way from Sydney territory. Renting is relatively stable, with weekly rents averaging 430 Australian dollars to 490 Australian dollars for a standard two-bedroom home. It's not dirt cheap, but it's predictable, which matters far more once income stops growing. For retirees easing into regional life, Tamworth offers a gentler rental market than coastal hotspots where competition can feel personal. Vacancy rates move, but not wildly enough to keep you awake at night refreshing listings. Tamworth suits retirees who want affordability, structure, and community, And who can tolerate the faint sound of a guitar solo drifting past the bakery? 6. Bundaberg. Bundaberg sits quietly on Queensland's coast, watching flashier neighbors soak up the attention while it gets on with the business of being affordable. That low profile is no accident, and for retirees, it's a feature, not a flaw. Bundaberg offers something increasingly rare in Australia: coastal proximity without the coastal ego or price tag. Housing remains one of its biggest strengths. Median house prices typically sit around 430,000 Australian dollars to 480,000 Australian dollars, depending on suburb and age of the property, with some older homes still sneaking in below that range. Rentals remain comparatively gentle by coastal standards, averaging 390 Australian dollars to 450 Australian dollars per week for a standard 2-bedroom home. In other words, you can live near the ocean without needing to emotionally prepare yourself before opening your bank app. The climate is warm most of the year, occasionally reminding you that air conditioning is not optional but a lifestyle expense. The pace of life is slow in the best way, the kind where nobody is in a rush, and if they are, it's considered suspicious. Outdoor living dominates, from walking paths to local markets and community clubs. Healthcare is solid for everyday needs, with a regional hospital and visiting specialists. More complex care may require travel, but most retirees manage comfortably without frequent trips. Bundaberg suits retirees who prioritize sunshine, affordability, and calm over nightlife and prestige. It's not postcard perfect, it's practical, lived in, and refreshingly honest. And in retirement, that honesty goes a long way. 5. Warrnambool. Warrnambool offers something that feels almost rebellious in modern Australia: coastal living that hasn't completely lost touch with reality. Sitting along Victoria's southwest coast, it delivers ocean air, dramatic scenery, and a pace of life that doesn't assume everyone is permanently late for something. It's the kind of place where the sea is part of daily life, not a luxury add-on with a premium price tag. Housing here is more expensive than inland regional towns, but still grounded compared to Melbourne. Median house prices generally sit around 530,000 Australian dollars to 580,000 Australian dollars, depending on proximity to the coast and how aggressively the previous owner embraced renovations. Rentals typically average 430 Australian dollars to 500 Australian dollars per week, with some seasonal tightening when tourists decide they too want to live by the sea. Warrnambool has a well-established regional hospital, meaning retirees aren't forced into long drives for routine or moderately complex care. That alone removes a major source of retirement stress. The town itself is walkable, community-minded, and quietly cultural: galleries, events, cafes, without tipping into exhausting. Warrnambool isn't the cheapest place to retire, and it knows it. What it offers instead is balance, livability, scenery, services, and a sense that life still functions at a human pace. For retirees willing to spend a little more to avoid chaos, it's a trade many are happy to make. 4. Devonport. Devonport sits on Tasmania's north coast, where the air is cooler, the conversations are calmer, and nobody seems particularly impressed by being busy. It's the kind of place where life naturally downshifts a gear, sometimes without asking, which is exactly why it attracts retirees who prefer quiet competence over constant stimulation. Housing remains one of Devonport's strongest appeals. Median house prices typically sit around 460,000 Australian dollars to 510,000 Australian dollars, depending on location and condition, while rentals average 370 Australian dollars to 430 Australian dollars per week. By coastal standards, especially compared to the mainland, those numbers are refreshingly sensible and far less likely to trigger spontaneous spreadsheet revisions. Everyday costs are mostly manageable. Groceries can run a little higher due to Tasmania's logistics, but that is often offset by lower housing costs and the absence of big city temptations. Utilities are reasonable, and the climate helps keep air conditioning bills firmly in check, a rare luxury in Australia. Healthcare covers essential needs locally, with more specialized services available in nearby cities like Launceston if required. Devonport rewards retirees who enjoy routine, scenery, and predictability. It's not a place for reinvention, late-life ambition, or finding your next chapter. It's a place for settling in, settling down, and quietly enjoying the fact that nothing feels urgent anymore. 3. Rockhampton. Rockhampton is often misunderstood. Mention it, and people think cattle, heat, and a level of humidity that tests personal resilience. What they don't immediately think of is affordability, which in retirement matters far more than impressing dinner guests. Rockhampton is quietly one of Queensland's most financially practical places to stop working without starting to panic. Healthcare access is strong, anchored by Rockhampton Hospital, a major regional base hospital with specialist services. That means fewer long drives and fewer "we'll need to refer you elsewhere" conversations. Daily life is straightforward and surprisingly pleasant. Shopping centers for essentials, riverside walks along the Fitzroy, and enough community clubs to keep social calendars comfortably full. Housing is where the town really shines. Median house prices typically sit around 390,000 Australian dollars to 430,000 Australian dollars, making them some of the lowest for a city of its size. Renting is equally reasonable, with weekly rents averaging 370 Australian dollars to 420 Australian dollars, a figure that offers genuine breathing room for retirees who prefer flexibility over ownership. Rockhampton isn't glamorous, and it doesn't pretend to be. It's functional, affordable, and reliable, which with age starts to look less like a compromise and more like excellent judgment. 2. Geraldton. Geraldton offers coastal living that still feels firmly connected to reality, a rare achievement in a country where "near the ocean" often translates to financially unhinged. For retirees willing to embrace Western Australia's sense of distance, the kind where maps suddenly feel very honest, the payoff is genuine affordability paired with lifestyle. Housing remains one of Geraldton's strongest selling points. Median house prices typically sit around 430,000 Australian dollars to 470,000 Australian dollars, depending on location and condition, with units available for less. Rentals are still manageable by coastal standards, averaging 390 Australian dollars to 440 Australian dollars per week for a two-bedroom home. In short, you get sea air without the kind of mortgage that lingers longer than your career did. Healthcare access is solid for most everyday needs, with a regional hospital and local services covering routine care. More specialized treatment may require travel to Perth, which is less ideal but rarely frequent. Daily life is relaxed, outdoors focused, and unapologetically unhurried. Think morning walks, long lunches, and neighbors who wave without needing a reason. Geraldton suits retirees who want ocean views without ocean prices, and who are perfectly content living beyond the East Coast spotlight, where affordability hasn't yet been chased out by hype. 1. Hervey Bay. Hervey Bay shows up in retirement conversations so often that it almost feels like cheating, but it earns the attention. Few coastal towns manage to balance affordability, climate, and accessibility as cleanly as Hervey Bay, and retirees have been quietly noticing for years. Housing remains relatively sensible for a seaside location. Median house prices generally sit around 490,000 Australian dollars to 530,000 Australian dollars, depending on suburb and proximity to the water. Rentals average 430 Australian dollars to 500 Australian dollars per week, which, while not pocket change, still looks remarkably gentle when compared to Brisbane or the Gold Coast. Importantly, prices here haven't yet detached entirely from local incomes, a rare and valuable trait. Hervey Bay Hospital provides solid regional coverage, supported by visiting specialists, meaning most day-to-day and ongoing medical needs can be handled locally. That reduces both travel costs and long-term stress. The lifestyle is calm and unapologetically age-friendly. Streets are walkable, the foreshore is flat, and the community is social without being intrusive. There's always something happening, but never so much that it feels exhausting. Hervey Bay doesn't advertise itself as a retirement town. It simply behaves like one. And for retirees, that practicality is exactly the point. Retirement is not about chasing perfection. It is about reducing risk. These towns do not promise paradise. They offer sustainability. And in an era where financial pressure follows people well past their working years, that may be the most valuable asset of all. And sometimes, the smartest retirement move isn't downsizing your home. It's downsizing your expectations and upgrading your quality of life instead. Which town got your attention? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you for watching.